Trump and Putin to meet in coming days, Kremlin aide says. US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin have agreed to meet in the coming days, a Kremlin aide has said. It follows Trump saying there was a good chance he could meet his Russian and Ukrainian counterparts together in person, very soon, to discuss ending the war in Ukraine. Trump's deadline for Russia to agree a ceasefire in Ukraine, or face more sweeping sanctions, is due to expire on Friday. A possible meeting between Trump and Putin would follow U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff, holding talks with the Russian president on Wednesday. Witkoff has traveled to Moscow 4 times previously, visits followed by optimism from Trump, but ultimately no major breakthrough in peace talks. Trump was also asked at a White House briefing on Wednesday night whether Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Putin had agreed to a 3-way summit, and he said there was a very good prospect. Kremlin aide Yuri Ushakov noted that the idea of a 3-way summit was mentioned at talks in Moscow on Wednesday, but was quoted by Russian news agencies as saying the option was left by Russia, without comment. Zelensky indicated his support for a summit, acknowledging that various formats of meetings had been discussed, 2 bilateral and 1 trilateral, and added that Europe must be a participant in any talks. He wrote on X. Ukraine is not afraid of meetings and expects the same brave approach from the Russian side. Ushakov said a location for a meeting between Trump and Putin had been agreed, with further details to be announced later. The official, who advises Putin on foreign affairs, said all parties have begun working on the details. Last month, Trump admitted to the BBC that after all 4 of Witkoff's previous visits, Putin had disappointed him, after talks had initially led to optimism. The US president is now striking a more cautious tone, telling reporters on Wednesday, "I don't call it a breakthrough. We have been working at this for a long time. There are thousands of young people dying. I'm here to get the thing over with." On Wednesday, the Kremlin released a vague statement about Witkoff's visit, calling the discussions constructive, and noting that both sides had exchanged quote-quote signals. Zelensky meanwhile said he had spoken to Trump about Witkoff's visit, with European leaders also on the call. The Ukrainian president has been warning that Russia would only make serious moves towards peace if it began to run out of money. Expectations are muted for a settlement by Friday, when Trump's deadline expires, and Russia has continued its large-scale air attacks on Ukraine despite the US threat of sanctions. As pressure builds, Trump on Wednesday signed an executive order imposing a 25% tariff on Indian imports over its continued purchase of Russian oil. Before taking office in January, Trump said he would be able to end the war between Russia and Ukraine in a day. The conflict has raged on, and his rhetoric towards Moscow has since hardened. 3 rounds of talks between Ukraine and Russia in Istanbul have failed to bring the war closer to an end, 3.5 years after Moscow launched its full invasion. Moscow's military and political preconditions for peace remain unacceptable to Kyiv and to its Western partners. Russian demands include Ukraine becoming a neutral state, dramatically reducing its military, and abandoning its NATO aspirations. It also wants Ukrainian military withdrawal from its 4 partly occupied regions in the southeast, and the demobilization of its soldiers. Russia also demands international recognition of Ukraine's Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions, as well as the annexed Crimea. Other conditions include a ban on Ukraine's membership in any military alliances, a limit on the size of the Ukrainian army, Russian as an official language, and the lifting of international sanctions on Russia. The Kremlin has also repeatedly turned down Kyiv's requests for a meeting between Zelensky and Putin. Meanwhile, the US approved $200 million, £150 million, in additional military aid to Ukraine on Tuesday, including support for drone production. Zelensky thanks Trump for productive talks ahead of ceasefire deadline. Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky has said he and Donald Trump discussed sanctions against Russia, defense cooperation, and drone production, ahead of a visit to Moscow by U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff. Thanking Trump for productive talks on Tuesday, Zelensky claimed that Moscow was particularly sensitive to the prospect of sanctions. Trump has previously stated that if Russia fails to agree a ceasefire with Ukraine by Friday, it will face hefty sanctions, or see secondary sanctions imposed against all those who trade with it. Witkoff will be in Moscow on Wednesday and is expected to meet Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin has mostly skirted Trump's sanctions threat, though spokesman Dmitry Peskov noted last week that the Russian economy had developed a certain immunity to sanctions due to being under them for so long. Trump has also admitted that he did not know whether sanctions bothered Putin. The US president may be hoping that Russia's trading partners will be sufficiently inconvenienced by the tariffs that they will choose to pivot away from buying Moscow's oil, ultimately making a dent in the revenue the Kremlin needs to continue waging its war on Ukraine. On Monday, Trump said he would impose hefty new tariffs on India, a major buyer of Russian oil, accusing it of not caring how many people in Ukraine are being killed by the Russian war machine. The Kremlin said, attempts to force countries to cut trade relations with Russia were illegal. In his Telegram post, Zelensky said he and Trump had also talked about the increased brutality of Russian strikes on Ukraine. The US president has previously referenced Moscow's repeated attacks on Ukrainian cities, signaling irritation that the bombings often follow nice phone conversations between himself and Putin. Only last February, Zelensky was asked to leave the White House after a disastrous meeting in which the US president accused him of not being thankful enough for US aid, and of gambling with World War III. The two men have gradually repaired their relationship. In July, Trump said the US would sell top-of-the-line weapons to NATO members, which would then pass them on to Kyiv. And this week it was announced that Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands and Sweden would be the first countries to buy weapons from the US under this scheme. Their combined contributions will amount to more than $1 billion and will go towards air defense equipment and ammunition. Danish Defense Minister Troels Lund Poulsen said speed was absolutely critical and that Denmark would be willing to consider additional funding later. More than 3 years on from Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukrainian cities continue to come under heavy bombardment and regular drone attacks. Over the last day, 6 people were killed across eastern Ukraine, authorities said. Before taking office, Trump repeatedly said he would be able to end the conflict within a day, and it was at his behest that Russia and Ukraine sat down for ceasefire talks for the first time last May. But the discussions failed to bring the two sides any closer to peace, and the US president has appeared increasingly impatient with the lack of progress. Despite Trump's looming deadline, Vladimir Putin last week poured cold water on any hopes of a swift, long-term ceasefire with Ukraine. Although he said he viewed talks with Kyiv positively, he also noted that, all disappointments arise from inflated expectations. Hit like, subscribe for more news.